I'm going to start with a brief introduction. My name is Larynx Gold. I'm one of the 38 people Thomas Hanna trained in 1990. And I'm also certified in the Rolf method of structural integration, which deals through the fascia with personal organization, efficiency, and integrity. And prior to my certification, I was a client of the Rolf method for some 20 years. So I have the experience of that work from both sides quite extensively. This session today is about the role and function of the fascia, seen both objectively as an organ of support and subjectively experienced through ways I'll discuss in this Hangout that we're doing now. Now, the fascia has been described as an organ of support, and it's in that sense commonly thought of in terms of soft tissue, but actually the fascia is an organ that pervades us completely. The fascia itself is composed of a protein called collagen, and collagen is an elastic protein. It's somewhat springy, and it's fibrous. And according to the location and function of the fascia, it's arranged in different ways. So the surface fascia is the dermis, and it lies just below the skin surface, and it consists of fibers in random pattern or organization similar to felt, the cloth felt. When the fascia is lined up in roughly parallel fibers and invested with contractile cells, we call it muscle. When it's invested with glandular cells, we call it gland. And when it's invested in adipose cells, we call it fat. It's invested with bone salts, we call it bone. And in fact, as the primal connective tissue, the fascia is protein-based, but according to its arrangement, it has different behavioral properties. And all this information I've just said is third-person perspective, so it's fascia looked at. However, the fascia has been found to be embedded with sensory receptors and with contractile cells. So the fascia is contractile, and it is also a means of being sensory aware of movement, position, and stress. And the fascia itself, by the feel of it, communicates to the nervous system where the support is and where it is needed, at which point muscular activity fills in. But the fascia is the primal organ of support. The fascia itself, being fibrous, is embedded in what's called a ground substance, also called interstitial ground substance, because it's between different kinds of tissues. And that ground substance is, in a word, gelatin. That's what it is. In fact, when gelatin is obtained in the manufacturing process, it's done from boiling skin and bone of animals slaughtered for food, and that gets out the gelatin. And another word for it is mucilage. If you've ever seen the bottles of mucilage used to seal envelopes, same stuff. It's gelatin. And in fact, the ground substance has adhesive properties. When the fascia is injured or damaged, you get a swelling effect. That's what happens with injuries. And at the same time, if there is a trauma reflex contraction due to the injury, circulation is impaired. And with the impairment of circulation comes the accumulation of metabolic waste products, getting in higher concentration in the tissues, which in effect means less water, more stuff dissolved in it. And the ground substance thickens, and it glues the neighboring region together. It glues the neighboring tissues together, and they call that adhesions. And it's a thickening of the ground substance. It's a dehydration, in effect, due to the accumulation of stuff dissolved in it. So the relative proportion of water is less. Pressure applied to the fascia causes a heating effect, and that melts or causes the ground substance to go from its gelled state to its sol, S-O-L state, and that's the liquid state, at which point tissues are free to move. And this is what Rolfers and those of that type are doing. They're getting the ground substance, in effect, to liquefy under pressure and then reposition or redistribute the fibers of the fascia. Fascia may be described in a way as clothing under the skin. Why clothing? Because when the fascia gets twisted or bunched, as it does in injuries, it restricts movement the same way as, say, a sweater, if it were twisted, would restrict your movement. The difference being, of course, that sweaters don't have an interstitial ground substance to glue them, whereas the fascia does. So the pattern of the gluing, so to speak, has to do with the pattern of injury, and there is always a sensation attendant with that, which is discussed in Somatic education as the trauma reflex. It is a cringe response to pain. However, something the fascia does that one might not anticipate is read the pattern of stress and support, or provide the information by sensation so the brain can read that information. And that in turn triggers patterns of muscular contraction, which is why under Rolfing, people get muscular relaxations in areas that are not directly engaged, say, in a particular session of Rolfing. It's because the support function is being adequately fulfilled by the organization or patterning of the fascia, the wrapping of it, and the muscles then are no longer needed. So you get these changes with good Rolfing, in which the person lengthens and relaxes. And that good Rolfing is what all Rolfing should be. But there are different grades of Rolfers, from garden variety, as Ida Rolf called them, cooks, to what she called chefs, people who could improvise without the recipe, which is what she called her 10-session series. It's referred to by Rolfers as the recipe. So there are two organs of memory involved in the fascia that retain movement patterns. I want to say store, but that's not right. They simply maintain or program in. And that is the patterning of the fascia and the sensory motor learning and habituation of the central nervous system. So these are two complementary systems. So I've largely talked here about the objective side of things, how it may be seen and described and analyzed. That the fascia itself is a feel thing. When the fascia is well organized, the person feels freer, they feel longer. But more than that, there is the emotional component to it. And it's not mysterious at all when understood correctly. In the case of any injury, there is trauma reflex, which is a cringe response. And that establishes a memory associated with that location in the person and that pattern of movement in the person. And in body work, from time to time, when a certain part is being worked, which is not how we do it in somatics, obviously, we don't work areas, we work with the client, okay? But in the domain of body work, it's working on a person. And when an area that has been involved in injury gets pressed upon, interfered with, caused a change, the sensation associated with that area is the same sensation associated with the memory of the injury. And so people commonly, from time to time, have a flushing up of the memory of the injury or of the emotional trauma. It could be either way. And that's because the sensation of the tissue is the sensation of the event, whether an injury or an emotional crisis or situation. So what I've described so far is the general structure of the fascia, the different forms it takes. I didn't mention cartilage, but it's the same thing. It's fascia invested with particular kind of cell. And so we've discussed the functions and structure of the fascia and generally its relation to the trauma reflex and the Hanna somatic education. The one thing that I have yet to discuss is this matter of equipoise or equipoise. Typically, when a person comes to either a Hanna somatic educator or Rolf practitioner, they are not in a state of balance, literally. The right side is different from the left side, front to back. The stresses are not balanced down a center line, but rather they are off center. So forces don't go through the center of joints, but rather they go kind of off center, eccentric. And that involves a pulling of the heads of bones as they meet in joints off center with relation to each other. And that creates joint distress. And of course, the distress feeds into the person's subjective life as emotional distress. At the very least, they feel drained by the pain of the injury, but more likely, they're experiencing a background sensation of either the stress pattern from the trauma or from the emotional condition that led to that pattern of contraction. And Rolfer's work to establish equipoise, which is to say a condition of balance, which is profound enough that Ida Rolf termed the sensation the peace of space. And I personally attest to the accuracy of that description. It's a very natural state, and it's a state essentially free of internal distraction. Unfortunately, emotional conditioning and neuromuscular memory patterns triggered by injury don't go away just from having the tissue manipulated, because the seat of those is not in the tissue, it's in actually the whole person, not just the nervous system either. And if you change something without changing other aspects of the same pattern, the other unchanged aspects tend to recreate or re-trigger the contracted condition. So I can attest again from personal experience, after some 25 years of getting Rolfing, I had an upsurge right about the mid 80s, actually, it was much sooner than 25 years, of subjective impulses, that is emotional states and habituated reaction patterns that had not been and could not be dealt with by being manipulated from the outside. These things must be changed from the inside out, even if there is outside guidance, even if there's outside assistance, such as tissue manipulation, unless the person encounters the subjective state that underlies the objective pattern of contraction, unless they encounter it in themselves in its own terms. That is, if it's an emotional memory, have to address it in those terms as emotional memory and deal with it via a process that's fitted to dealing with that kind of conditioning. And Rolfing, although it has the effect of surfacing things and does indeed cause some things to resolve because they're not so deeply entrenched, Hanna somatic education may deal with, say, sorrowful states that's tied in with breathing, or fearful states, both of which are tied in with startle reflex. And a person may, on occasions, get a shift and a release from the pattern if they're that close to releasing it already. But if they aren't that close to releasing it, the change will be limited in its scope, that is, its completeness of addressing the entire pattern, and the intensity of the change, that is, the thoroughness of it. It will be limited. It must be addressed in the terms in which and as which it lives in the person. So that includes attitudes, beliefs, emotions, concepts. All of these exist as patterns of contraction in a person, patterns of tension, patterns of readiness to react or to act, states of readiness that are so familiar that they are subterranean. They are, in effect, sensory motor amnesia, but they're not associated with a particular injury. They're associated with, or the expression of, the person's lifelong conditioning, starting with family attitudes and behaviors. And then as a person gets older and gets exposed to different influential sources by the educational system, the attitudes of religion, social attitudes, the news media, and the entertainment media, all of which feed conditioning into the person that leads to patterns of habitual contraction. And this is exactly true of the entertainment media today, which is so thoroughly corrupt that they're scraping the bottom of the barrel with so-called entertainment around themes of danger, violence, emergency, stress, sinister things, and evil. Just look at the content of most of what's coming out nowadays. And you'll see that that people who absorb this stuff are absorbing stress conditions, but they don't have very good discrimination or discernment. In other words, they don't have good taste. And so they indulge in these so-called entertainments, which, by the way, includes the news. You should wonder why they call them news stories instead of news reports. The answer is because they're there essentially to entertain. Watch news, you'll see how little of it is actionable. Most of it is just, I would call it sick entertainment. Disasters, air crashes, crises that are not actionable by a person. I'm not referring to earthquakes where one might send money to help an afflicted area, but you know what I mean when you look at the news and you see how much of it is gossip, and it's essentially all junk food that gets fed into the person's experience and which forms into the person's memory impressions of existence. And in the case of stress-oriented material, triggers stress reactions. The person gets more uptight. They may not even identify it as that. They may not even notice that they feel worse after watching the news or a particular form of entertainment than before. This is what I mean by bad taste or poor discrimination. Now, what happens as that kind of stress condition becomes entrenched in the person is they get tighter. And it's not just the muscles that get tighter, it's the entire fascial network. Organs contract in peculiar ways, as well as the muscles. And I would say also the fascia in between, the packing material between organs, and that enwraps muscles or sheaths like the interosseous membranes that form kind of like a sail, as in a boat, between a large bone and a smaller bone, say the tibia and the fibula, or the radius on the ulna. You have this membrane which goes the length of the bones along the inner surface and forms a tissue connection between them. Now, the reason I say this is in my own work, working with the subjective processes that I developed, which are based on what I call the tetraseed, the arc soma, the deep structure of all somatic existence, which consists of attention, intention, memory, and imagination. And if someone chimes in and asks me to elaborate upon that, I will. Right now, I'll just say that there are procedures I developed to surface and dispel the equivalent of sensory motor amnesia, where it exists not from physical injuries, but from stress and repetitive patterns of attention giving, particularly to unhealthy or unwholesome situations. When I've worked these procedures in myself and undergone the releases, I commonly undergo shifts of my own shape. leg lengthening, the sacrum repositioning, breathing expanding, vertebrae popping, changes of neck position, sitting, coming from generally from a more forward head position, more and more towards a head up, upright, elongated position. So the soft tissue clearly responds to emotional, mental, and conceptual and intuitive changes in the person. The fascia is what is doing the responding, whether it's muscle or the subcutaneous layer of dermis, which is really what gives the skin its tensile strength. It doesn't matter. All the fascia is organically and spontaneously involved in those kinds of changes. So it's the fascia that must lengthen. Face it, if I feel like my whole right side lengthens from a certain release, the fascia is what makes up my right side. Fascia lengthens. So I've explained how the emotional state and mental content affects tension, how it affects the fascia, and how when body workers encounter contracted places in a person and they kind of forcibly induce lengthening, they magnify the sensation of that area to the person, that sensation being the same as the sensation of that area in response to the injury or emotional stress pattern. So I've shown an objective correlation with the subjective side, explained the role of fascia in its correlate with the muscular system, and how fascia underlies the shape and formation of bones. What I haven't said much about is the fascia within the brain area itself. And when you look at it, the dura mater, the wrapping around the brain, is fascia. It's fascia of a particular fibrous arrangement. And same thing with the other protective layers around the brain. And of course, the brain shape itself is a reflection of the fascial pattern in which are invested neurons, which make up the brain. So even though the brain is 80% fat, and therefore we are 80% fatheads, it's also true the fascia goes into the brain cavity, and it actually gives shape to that cavity and to the wrappings of the brain and to the brain itself. In the head, all of that is experienced as intercranial pressures. The bones of the head are not a single unit like a bowling ball. There's a degree of float between them, a degree of flexibility in those sutures, which are held together by fascia. That's what ligaments are. Ligaments are fascia without much of anything else invested in it, no contractile cells. The periosteum, the wrapping of bone, is fascia, and the three major differentiated layer or recognized layers of muscle, the endometrium, mesometrium, and exometrium. Is that what the term exometrium? I don't think that's correct. Three layers of organization, from the finest at level of muscle fiber to clusters of muscle fiber in what are called fasciculi, to clusters of clusters to the entire belly of the muscle. All of that gets its shape from the patterning of the fascia. And the patterning of the fascia maintains function, patterns of function, and in effect learns patterns of function. And with that, they learn patterns of sensation, those tissues do. So the sensation is learned. Consider for a moment that your ability to sense things is acquired by learning. Everyone learns to see, well or badly. They learn the distinctions of smell and taste and hearing. They learn the feelings of speech and how to make the sounds of speech, and thereby learn sounds that way. And then all the sounds of language, and then all the sounds of other forms of culture, like car horns and music. It's all learning based, and they set up a pattern of tension in the fascia, which objectively corresponds to the subjective experience. So that's the basics of what I have to say about fascia. If anybody wants to ask or tell, you may activate your camera and microphone and speak up. And again, if people want to engage in conversation here, same thing, come on camera and we make this a conversation. So I'm just going to wait for a bit. And if I get some people who want to participate, fine. Otherwise, I'll terminate the call. Okay. So I'm not getting any response here from anybody wanting to participate. So I'm going to say one more thing that occurred to me about the fascia. Because the work Rolfing is also and more properly known as structural integration, I've got to talk a bit more about integration. The fascia, apart from the skin, actually all fascia communicates directional pulls. Even the skin, if you tug on your skin, other skin goes along with it, and that creates sensations of pull or restriction elsewhere than the place you were tugging on. The line of pull of the fascia from different segments of the skeletal structure, feet, lower legs, thighs, tibia, pelvis, and so forth, each of those at a flex point at the joints, at each of those points, the fascia of one segment may communicate the weight-bearing stresses accurately across the joint to the fascia on the other side of the joint in such a way that the pulls are very well communicated from section to section, as opposed to, say, the segment of one side, the pull leaving off at one point, and at the other next segment, the pull picking up somewhat off line from that. And that's poor integration. And that kind of sensation leads to automatic muscular stresses controlled by postural reflexes below consciousness. So if we're going to talk about integration of the fascia, has to do with movement. And the fascia, just as with a sweater that you're wearing that may be twisted or bunched, if the fascia is not lined up well with its neighboring fascial envelopes, then you get restricted movement as you would with a twisted sweater. And when the fascia is well organized so that the person is pretty continuous throughout without interruptions, disruptions, or distortions, there's a whole different feel that the person has. Their presence has more coherence. They are more of a piece. They sound more coherent. Thought processes are clearer. Thought processes are sharper. These are all things that occurred for me during my pre-somatics days when I was getting Rolfing. And after a session, I would suddenly be able to just talk about or describe things that I was able before tacitly to sense, but not clearly enough to surface and put into words. So as my integration improved, I got access to places in myself that before were unavailable to me. And some call that insight. So by organizing the fascial network, a person's intelligence actually increases. Same thing with somatic education, well done. The intelligence of the person, their integrity, their competence, their coherence increases. However, to the degree that it's interfered with by subjective conditioning, that is learned attitudes, behaviors, emotional states acquired through experience, those must be dealt with on their own terms. You can support the change by bringing better organization to the fascia, but my experience personally, in roughly starting in the mid 80s, was a massive upwelling of all of the stuff that had been in effect avoided by the patterning of my own fascial network in keeping with a high degree of integrity that I did not have in my character. I wasn't that sharp, that keen, and I hadn't done that much work on myself. And so I had this massive upwelling, which in effect put me into crisis for about 20 years, what I call the massive, I call it the calamity, the cleanup that it required in me to make my own, call it subjective conditioning, congruent with the changes of the tissue that I had undergone in some bunches of years of rolfing. And I had a lot. I quit counting at around 200 hours of that work. And just as a parallel aside, early on in my rolfing, I saw what the process was doing in terms of my both physical well-being and my mental clarity and awakening. I wanted more sessions sooner, and my rolfer said, no, I needed time to integrate the changes. I asked, what can I do to make that happen faster? And he taught me the first somatic education exercises I've learned. And those are exercises developed by Ida Rolf in collaboration with Judith Aston, who later went off to form her own school of somatic education called Aston Patterning, which I also have experienced. And I practiced those somatic education exercises consistently, that is pretty much daily, and sometimes for extended periods, until I went into training with Thomas Hanna. And when I went into training, what he was telling us was very familiar to me. It was very familiar territory, because I'd had some 20 years or more, yeah, that's about right, 20 years of experience working with what were called the structural patterning movements. And here's a distinction between that and the Feldenkrais-Hanna lineage of somatic education exercises. Is out of the Rolf lineage, the interest and concern is with balance and symmetry, getting the right and left sides to mirror each other closely, and for balance and weight to be organized around a central core called the Rolf line, which is an alignment of greatest length that is generally traced from the center of the ears to shoulders, hips, and down to the location of the feet, just barely in front of the heels. So balance is the emphasis of that lineage, whereas freedom is the emphasis in the Feldenkrais-Hanna lineage. And it's freedom pretty much devoid of technical methods for cultivating balance, just as the exercises out of the Rolf lineage were good at getting balance, but balance around a central line, which can lead to a kind of fixation at balance rather than a freedom of range of motion at balance. Yes, that occurs, but it's certainly not the emphasis of those exercises or the main product. So we have two different approaches. I personally see with both perspectives, and so in myself and in my work with clients, I'm looking for both freedom of movement and balance and freedom. Well, all right then. One more time to open for anyone who wants to participate. Give it 15 seconds. All right then. So that's our show. And this video will be available shortly. In case you're thinking of going after it right after I'm finishing here, no, I have to do a bit of editing at the beginning to remove some dead space before we actually began from the beginning. So that's it for now.